Today we'll just sort of introduce a little bit about energy in cells, and then we'll, all right, good. Then we will go into just a sort of basic overview of the two parts of photosynthesis, and we'll get into more of the detail about what happens in those parts another time. So first of all, we're shifting gears now, and we're going to talk about energy in cells. So we'll start with photosynthesis. We'll talk about respiration as well, two processes that are really important in how energy is captured and used within cells. So we know that living things, living cells, must have a source of energy, otherwise they cannot survive. In order to maintain homeostasis, to maintain balance, to stay alive, to reproduce, cells must have energy. And in cells, what form does that energy usually take? What do cells actually use as energy? ATP. ATP is just a molecule that's able to store energy, and then that stored energy can be used to do different types of work within the cell. So there's sort of three categories of what energy is needed for, of what type of work has to be done inside of the cells. So one of those types of work is mechanical work, actually physically moving things around within the cell. If you remember back, a good example of this, to that first video we watched when we talked about cells, it had that motor protein sort of dragging a vesicle along a microtubule step by step. It's physically moving that vesicle from one place to another. That requires energy. We just finished talking about active transport. So to maintain the proper concentration of different materials, often molecules and atoms need to be pumped into or out of the cell. That takes energy. Active transport to move molecules against the concentration gradient requires energy in the form of ATP. And also chemical reactions often require energy. Some release energy, some require energy. And that energy can come from ATP. So ATP is the key component of cellular energy. So the molecule ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. That's what the word, the letters stand for. Here we have a diagram showing a molecule of ATP. And if you look at it, it should look a little bit familiar. From what our discussions of biochemistry, does it look like anything we've already talked about? We saw adenine, we saw ribose, and we saw phosphate, all in another type of, a class of molecules, which is sort of like a cousin to ATP. Where did we see adenine? Caitlin? No. It's in another class of biological molecule, Dean.
DNA and RNA.
Yeah, DNA and RNA. Remember the bases? A, T, G, and C? The A is adenine. What is ribose? Any ose is a sugar. Ribose is a sugar. These are just inorganic phosphates. So this is similar to an RNA molecule. RNA had a ribose as a sugar, had a single phosphate, and had a base. This is similar. But this is ATP, adenosine, we have the adenine, we have the ribose, and then we have three phosphates, triphosphate. When the three phosphates are there, you could think of it as it's storing energy. Okay. When that energy is then used, Okay, the energy is stored in these bonds. So this bond between the phosphates is what we call a high energy bond. When that bond is broken, it can release a significant amount of free energy that can be used to do work. And that's what happens. When we say the cell uses ATP, what actually happens is that final phosphate is sort of broken off, that high energy bond is broken, and that free energy that is released can be used to do something. To move that motor protein, to transport things across the cell, to cause a chemical reaction to take place. So when we say ATP is used, this is what's happening. And once that phosphate, that high energy bond is broken, the energy has basically been used up. How can we go from this back to this again? Yeah, if we take that phosphate and bond it on again, now the molecule's sort of charged up again. Think of it as like a battery. You use up the energy from the battery, but then if you plug it in, if you charge it up, you can go back to storing that energy again. And so ATP turns into ADP, but then it can be recycled by other processes to attach that phosphate again. So ATP is kind of like a battery in this case. This just shows in a sort of visually the types of work we mentioned. The ATP, right, being used to power that motor protein, to transport materials across the concentration gradient, or to allow chemical reactions to take place. ATP does those things, and at the end, you're left with ADP, adenosine diphosphate, meaning two phosphates, plus this inorganic phosphate that sort of got broken off, releasing energy. So ATP is involved in both photosynthesis and respiration. So let's start talking a little bit about respiration. I have a few questions about this video. Do these kids get paid, I wonder? This kid's got to be famous. I'd love to see him today. Somebody wants to do something.
They should not have any TikTok there.
They have millions of views. Who's making the money on this video?
Demonetize it.
Two Little Lanes TV.
Why would they like me to watch it?
Child labor.
Oh wait, what happened?
You ain't getting no TikTok ads, buddy.
Photosynthesis is how plants.
She's the one that makes.
She's making the money, I bet.
Yeah. Look at that. That's Louis Vuitton and Gucci, bro.
Photosynthesis, photosynthesis, photosynthesis.
This one's
Plants don't have a mouth like you and me. They have to eat. So they spread their leaves so green to capture sunlight's energy. Plants don't have a nose like you and me.
Secondhand embarrassment.
Dude, that one looks like Casey.
That's amazing. That's cool. That's photosynthesis, photosynthesis. Plants can't do the cup like you and me.
Casey.
So they push their roots deep down to soak up water from the ground. Plants don't wear green hats or shirts or jeans. So why it's because all plants have white twins with chlorophyll.
Chlorophyll is the green chemical focus on the plants. It helps them trap light, and without it, there'd be no
Photosynthesis, plants can make their very own food.
I forgot about this place. Yo,
It's a bridge, yeah.
That's because all plants are filled with green stuff like chlorophyll. That's photosynthesis, photosynthesis. That's photosynthesis, photosynthesis.
All right. So yeah. Not right now. Not right now. That's the next
One
slide.
without the other.
Really godly one.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about the pigments. So photosynthesis, first of all, is vital to life on Earth in general. Photosynthesis captures sunlight and turns it into a form that actually living organisms can use. Okay? And it also is responsible for the oxygen in the atmosphere. Before photosynthesis evolved, there was no free oxygen, or very little free oxygen in the atmosphere. After organisms evolved that could go through the process of photosynthesis, oxygen started building up. And so the basics is that photosynthesis converts light energy into chemical bond energy. It's basically an energy transformation. It's a photochemical reaction. It's a chemical reaction that requires light in order to happen. And there are special compounds that are responsible for absorbing that light energy and sort of harnessing it. We call them pigments. And in chloroplasts, you've probably heard of one pigment. Which one? Chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is a pigment. Okay? It is often the dominant pigment in many plants. It appears green. And there's actually multiple types of chlorophyll. They're called chlorophyll A, B, C, and D. So when we look at the plants over there, as you see them, the dominant pigment in most of those plants is chlorophyll. That's why they all look green. But there are other pigments as well. You'll notice in this coleus. Okay? Chlorophyll is not the most dominant pigment that you see when you look at this plant. The leaves are sort of this reddish color. This plant has sort of a purplish reddish leaf. So there are other pigments that also capture sunlight. And typically these pigments are capturing sunlight from a different part of the spectrum. We know that white, what we call white light, is actually a mixture of various wavelengths of light that combine. And so different pigments, we'll look at this in a second, can capture certain parts of that spectrum. Another pigment that is often found in plants is carotene. Carotene appears orange. It's the main pigment that makes carrots orange, and squash and oranges have an abundance of carotene, giving them their orange color. Xanthophylls are yellowish. Anthocyanins are red. And many plants have all of these pigments. And that allows them to capture light from a variety of parts of the spectrum. When we look at a graph of the photosynthetic pigments found in plants, this graph shows the various wavelengths. And it shows how these pigments absorb light at different parts of the spectrum. So we see when we look at chlorophyll A absorbs heavily here in the blue end of the spectrum, and then also absorbs in sort of the reddish end as well. Chlorophyll B has a slightly different profile, absorbing more towards the greenish end of the electromagnetic spectrum. And the carotenoids. Okay? And chlorophyll F is up here at the red end. And so what we see is that these various pigments can absorb light from different parts, allowing the plant to capture as much energy as possible. Now, what do you notice about this graph? What seems to be missing? What's the worst, if you were using specific colors of light to grow a plant, what would be the worst color to use?
Yellow.
Yeah, yellowish green. This plant that has all of these pigments has very little absorbance in this area of the spectrum. That kind of makes sense when you look at leaves. What color do they look usually? Why do they look green?
That's the one color.
So why do things appear a certain color? Because they reflect that color and don't absorb it. So leaves look green because most of the green is being reflected to our eyes and not being absorbed. Now for lots of plants, green is the dominant pigment, chlorophyll is the dominant pigment, but in deciduous trees that lose their leaves, when the winter season is coming, when light intensity is going to be lower, often many types of trees, the chlorophyll stops being regenerated by the plant, okay, as an adaptation to sort of conserving energy, and the other pigments start to become visible because the chlorophyll is not dominating. And so leaves turn red or orange or yellow depending on what the levels of those other pigments they have. That's why our leaves in our area change color in the autumn. So we know that photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast, that's the organelle. Let's talk about it in a little more detail. Chloroplasts are sort of cylinder shaped and they have a few parts to them. So they're double membranes. So they have two membranes around the outside. Then on the inside we have these sacs of photosynthetic pigments. They're called thylakoids. They often look like maybe a stack of like poker chips or something. Okay, stacked on top of each other. The stacks themselves are called grana. And the space in between them is filled with fluid called the stroma. Those are the parts of the chloroplast. So when in real life, this is an electron microscope image, they don't look quite so neat with these nice little stacks of chips and stuff. This is more what they actually look like. This entire thing is a chloroplast. Here we have this space is the stroma. These little darkened areas are the grana. You'll also see in here these starch granules because photosynthesis that's going on in this chloroplast, excess glucose is stored in the form of starch that the plant can then use. So we'll kind of stop in a minute by giving a general overview of photosynthesis. As I said, we're going to get into more detail than we have in the past. So this is the equation you guys learned back in 7th grade, and it's correct. Carbon dioxide plus water produces glucose and oxygen. This equation is balanced as a chemical equation really should be. So to produce one molecule of glucose, it actually takes 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules to produce one molecule of glucose. So that's why we have these 6's here as coefficients. Those are sort of the reactants on the left, the raw materials. On the right are the products. But there are other chemicals, other molecules, other things involved in the process. Obviously, requires light. It also requires certain enzymes. It needs pigments in order for all this to happen. But those aren't a part of the actual rearranging of the atoms. Those aren't part of the chemical equation of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis happens in sort of 2 phases. And we'll talk about those this year. So the 2 phases they have a lot of different names. Sometimes they're called the light reactions and dark reactions, or the light dependent reactions and the Kelvin cycle. The light reactions and carbon fixation, they all mean the same thing, but there's 2 phases. This one on top, the light reactions, and then we're going to call it the Kelvin cycle on the bottom. And they're both required for photosynthesis. So let's look at them. So the light-dependent reactions. Okay? These are the ones, obviously, by the name, they require light. Okay? This bottom section actually doesn't use light. But the light reactions do. They take in water. They also need light. And what happens in these light reactions is that the water molecule gets split into hydrogen and oxygen. And the oxygen is released at the end of this process. This happens in the grana, in those stacks. And the light reactions produce several things. They produce ATP, which we've learned about. They also produce an energy carrier called NADPH. Those two things, ATP and NADPH, are needed for the second phase, the Calvin cycle. So the light reactions produce those things and sort of send them on to the Calvin cycle. In the Calvin cycle, that's when the carbon dioxide is needed. It doesn't actually require light, but it does require the products of the light reactions. It takes in ATP, takes in NADPH and carbon dioxide, and this is where the carbon is captured and changed into glucose. It also produces ADP and NADP, which go back into the light reactions to sort of be recycled again and sent back into the Calvin cycle. So here's in another form. Light reactions happen in the grana. Take in light, take in water, release oxygen. They produce NADPH, produce ATP, which goes into the Calvin cycle, which is going to transform the carbon from carbon dioxide into glucose. It also releases these products back to the light reactions to be recycled. So ATP gets recycled to ADP, NADPH gets used and sent back and recycled again. So this cycle happens within the chloroplast, in the grana and in the stroma. So the Calvin cycle actually doesn't need light itself, but when there's no light, the light reaction shut off, the production of ATP and NADPH shut off, and therefore the Calvin cycle can't continue running. So actually, they both stop when there's no light, even though the light reactions are the one that require. All right, we'll talk in more detail about both the light reaction and Calvin cycle in the next few slides, but we're not going to get to that today.